Well, the day I arrived was August 26, 1926, and all the bishops of the province were here to greet me. Archbishop Hannah of San Francisco, who officiated at my installation in the cathedral. I sang a pontifical, or attempted to sing anyway, a solemn high pontifical mass at the cathedral. The cathedral had never been occupied by my predecessor, Archbishop Christie. It had not been finished. It was not quite finished when I came, but we could use it all right. And so I was the first bishop to officiate in the present cathedral in Portland. When I came, there were, I think, if I remember rightly, 78 priests of the Archdiocese of Portland who were incarnated in the Archdiocese. There were several externs who were helping out here to supply the need. And there were about 100, or perhaps a few more than 100 priests who belonged to various religious communities who were working full-time in this archdiocese. I don't recall exactly the number of priests according to the census lists that we had, the number of people, Catholics, in the archdiocese at that time, but as I recall it, the census lists gave about 60,000 Catholics in the whole archdiocese. Of course, I know the census lists were not complete at that time, but they would give you some idea of the approximate number of Catholics that were in the archdiocese at that time. The city of Portland was a very attractive city then, as it is now, but it was very much smaller. I think it could scarcely have been a third of the size that it is now in population, but I was very much impressed with it. Very beautiful city, and I was very graciously received by the clergy and the people. Many changes, of course, have taken place in the city and in the whole terrain here in western Oregon. I was very pleased with it from the very beginning. It made a very great impression on me, and that impression has grown with the years. It has become so much a part of me here, and I feel so much a part of this country that I'd find it quite impossible to live anyplace else.
Had that been your first glimpse of Oregon, the time when you landed here as Archbishop?
No, I had paid a very brief visit here in the summer of 1911. Another priest from Dubuque, Iowa, where I was living at the time. I was on the staff of Loras College in Dubuque, boys' college, and we came out on a little vacation trip. We stopped in various places en route to the west coast, and one of the places was Portland. We were here about 4 days, as I recall, and the late Archbishop O'Hara and I were classmates in the St. Paul Seminary, St. Paul, Minnesota, and we were always very close friends as fellow students. So he was ordained for the Archdiocese of Portland. I was ordained for the Archdiocese of Dubuque. And because of the great distance between Portland and Dubuque, we rarely met during those first 5 years. I had been ordained, and Bishop O'Hara, at that time, 5 years. During those 5 years, we had rarely met. We used to correspond occasionally. So I was delighted in having the opportunity of renewing our acquaintance and our friendship. And he was very kind, very gracious to us during our stay in Portland. Took us around and showed us all the different sites in the city of Portland. And at that time, the new Marylhurst Convent was just starting construction. They had, I think, had their novitiate, their mother house and all at St. Mary's Academy in Portland up to that time. So he took me out there, and Christie Home had been in operation, I think, then just a year. I've forgotten the name of the chaplain who was there at the time. He was a very elderly man. We had lunch with him, and it was in early July, as I recall, the time of our visit here, and the cherries were just ripe. And I had never been accustomed to fresh cherries before, and I thoroughly enjoyed them and ate to my fullest capacity, I assure you, and enjoyed very much.
What year was that, Archbishop?
That was in the summer of 1911. I must tell you of my experience in meeting Archbishop Christie. I had never met him, of course, before, and so he was living at the old Cathedral Rectory at that time. He had his apartment on the second floor of the old Cathedral Rectory, and this priest companion of mine and I went up to call on Father O'Hara at that time. He was assistant at the old cathedral. So we had a very nice visit with him, and as we were preparing to leave, we were standing on the first floor of the old Cathedral Rectory, and Archbishop Christie came down the stairs, and as he was coming down, he looked down over the banister, and he said, "Whom have we here?" So when he got down on the floor, Father O'Hara presented us to him, and had he said at that time, in presenting me, "Archbishop Christie, this is your successor," he would have been correct. I succeeded Archbishop Christie, I think, 15 years later.
Would you have believed if Christie had told you that you were going to succeed him?
Well, you know, I often think what a very great blessing of Providence that we don't know the future. I'm sure Archbishop Christie would have, fainted.
So would you.
And I would have run for dear life, I think. But, I didn't realize what a treasure I was getting in coming out here to this beautiful country. And then all the priests that I was to be associated with later, wonderful priests. They were the treasure awaiting me, And finally I got to know them and appreciate them and enjoy them.
I think the question of the cathedral, Archbishop, you brought out that it was still under repair. To the best of my knowledge, in 1926, somewhere in the middle of Lent, they had devotions as the opening of the cathedral church. That is the present one that we're at the present time. There was no formal opening at that time for the Mass, but there was a rosary and a sermon and benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, as far as we can find out in the Sentinel now. And this was about the middle of, I would say probably about the middle of March somewhere. It could have been in there. We have the records in the files exactly when that occurred. And then shortly came the appointment of Archbishop Howard, and then they simply waited for any other formalities that might come from later on. As a matter of fact, this might be interesting as long as it's not going to be public. We have never discovered the blessing of that cathedral, the formal blessing.
I don't think it was ever formally blessed.
Well, Archbishop, I don't know. All we could say, I ran into it. Father Campbell, as you know, was pastor, and they have the Lenten services that evening, and I went through it very, very closely, and I would assume that it would have been some consequence of a solemn blessing. I think possibly what happened that Father Campbell got permission to bless it from Monsignor Hildebrand, who was the administrator at that time. So I called Archbishop Howard on it and asked him if he had blessed it, and he said, no, I took it for granted it was blessed.
Well, I think it was blessed,
with holy water.
Informally.
Well, I say with holy water, but I think I doubt it. Historically, if if anyone
But,
can prove that it was really blessed with a solemn blessing as we understand. Now
It had been used as a parish church, of
Yes.
course, for several months before I came, although it was not completely, the building was not completely finished. But they had been using it, I know, as a parish church for some months.
Well, I say, Archbishop, we did run into the Sentinel, in which they formally opened it, if you could call them formality. The opening services were the Lenten services during the evening, and those were the days when you didn't have an evening mass. You just had the Lenten services on a Wednesday or Friday night.
Did the parish ever keep anything like announcement books? Or their Sunday announcements where that might have occurred?
Well, so far we have not run into anything, and certainly I would say, had there been a public blessing of a church, a dedication of a church, the Sentinel certainly would have carried it.
Yeah.
And I've gone page by page in that and I've found nothing. Now, I may have missed it, but I would assume that it would be on the first page on that.
Did you know, Bishop, that they had problems with the altar? There was an Italian who had the contract to build that altar, you see. And as he was putting that big piece of marble in front, he dropped it and broke it. And the question was whether he was going to have to spend a long time getting a new one, or whether that could be fixed up. It was actually fixed up, and a special financial provision was made for it, but that was the story.
Mm-hmm.
Father Laidlaw and Father Muffenbauer were two seminarians, weren't you, at the time when Archbishop
Right.
Howard came?
Right.
What was your impressions of the new Archbishop? Were you apprehensive about the new man in power?
No, we were very
I
much
imagine at the
in...
time as a seminarian you don't worry about it. It's only after your ordination you become apprehensive, Father.
I was at St. Paul at the time, which is the seminary where His Grace matriculated.
Well, I remember when the news came out, Father O'Hara then was pastor of St. Mary's, Eugene, and I remember he rang all the bells of the church because there were only a very few who actually personally knew Archbishop Howard before he came. They would be Father George Thompson,
And
Father O'Hara. Father Waite was in the seminary. Was he at the time at all?
For 1 year.
But at least he would know who you were. And what was the name of this Polish priest? I think he was about that time.
Sarowski?
Sarowski. Wasn't he back there also, Archbishop?
Yes, I really didn't know him in the seminary.
But at least he might know the name.
He was 3 or 4 years ahead of me. And,
But I would say that because before the announcement, it was a tremendous long time of the announcement, which would be rather odd at the present time, because it was over a year after Christie died, before Archbishop Howard was appointed, and that was a very long time. And I think they had everybody appointed to this archdiocese except the Holy Father himself. The papers were constantly telling about this bishop and rumors, so that the name of Howard was absolutely, no one ever heard of him except the very few classmates.
At
We had a
Menlo,
seminary.
at Menlo Park, they suspected me of not being entirely pro-Irish, and they told
on
me
good
of
grounds.
some very strong Irishman who had just been made bishop, and he was really partisan on the question.
Well,
And they claimed I would change my name to Patrick O'Laidlaw, which I did not do.
Yeah, but
There was a priest here when I came, Father Brunagel. He was in the seminary in St. Paul for perhaps a year with me. I never got acquainted with him really in the seminary, but I remembered seeing him there. He was several years ahead of me. And so he had an old class picture of the students in the St. Paul Seminary that had been taken, I think, perhaps the first year that I was in the seminary. That would be in 1900. And so he got it out. It was a very large picture, you know. There must have been a couple of hundred students in it. And, he said, I know the new Archbishop, Archbishop Howard. And they said, well, pick him out in that group if you can, and we will use his picture, because they didn't have any picture of me, you know, at that time.
Charlie Smith would never print it anyway.
So Brunagel picked out somebody. It was not I. He picked out someone he was sure was, you know, I, but it wasn't. And so they were all, you know, wondering about me. And when I came, I looked quite different from the picture.
One of them
Well, I think
both
it-
resemblance.
I think of the diocesan priests, Father Joe Hesacker, Father Louis Sander, and myself, were the first to have met you, Archbishop. We met you at the Hilton Hotel in Chicago. We had gone on to the Eucharistic Congress, which was held in June, and Joe and Louis and I made an appointment. And I remembered we were quite concerned. The Archbishop was an hour and a half late. I don't remember what his reason was. That's the only time I remember he was ever late for any appointment in my life.
I didn't know that I was due at any specified time. I was just told that I was to meet you at the Hilton Hotel, but I was not given any definite time as far as I recall.
That's the best excuse I've heard so far.
So I just waited and waited until the automobile came for me that was to take me over to the Hilton Hotel. And I sized you up very carefully that time.
I wouldn't be surprised. We did the same. Don't worry.
And I know I was very much impressed.
I would say very likely we were the first diocesan priests.
Oh, you were the
your
first
classmates that had met you in Chicago. That was in June of 1926. There was the appointment. There was about 4 or 5 months from the time of your appointment to the time you came, wasn't it, Archbishop?
About 3 months.
3 months, was it?
I think so.
Well, longer than that. Weren't you appointed in April?
April 30th, I think.
April 30th. You had May, June, July,
August.
That's
and
right.
August.
It was longer.
Almost 4 months. Pretty close to 4 months before your appointment until...
You see, I was auxiliary bishop of Davenport, the Diocese of Davenport, Iowa at the time, and the Bishop of Davenport, Bishop Davis at that time, was in very poor health. So I delayed my coming out here as long as I could. And finally I wrote the delegate, and he said, well, I think you had better go on out to Portland. We were expecting the death of Bishop Davis almost any time. But he lived until, I think, sometime that following December.
I think just a brief historical note would be, before Archbishop Howard came here, is the story of his first ordinations of 3 priests, of which one is still living. Archbishop Howard would have more of the information approximately. As I remember, it was April, wasn't it, 24 that you ordained Monsignor Code?
I think it was. I don't remember the exact date, but it must have been very late in April.
Yes.
I was consecrated. I think they call it an ordination now. I was consecrated a bishop on the 8th of April, 1924. And I got to Davenport just in time. I went down the following week after my consecration and officiated at the Holy Week services because Bishop Davis of Davenport was unable because of ill health to officiate. And then the following week, I think, I ordained those 3 young men.
Well, there's only one of them living. Monsignor Code claims to be the first
Yes, he was the very
ordination
first
because
one. He came out the first one for
with a
ordination.
C. And so Monsignor Code at the present time is not well. He's living. He was ordained, was it for the Davenport Archdiocese or what
Davenport,
diocese?
yes. Mm-hmm.
But now at the present time he's living in St. Louis, but not well. And I had a letter from him just recently hoping that Archbishop Howard could officiate at the time of his Golden Jubilee to the priesthood, which of course would be very remarkable in the sense if they could both say Mass together. One would be the ordination of his ordination, the Golden Jubilee, and the other would be the Golden Jubilee of consecration. Mm-hmm. The first time in history of the United States that anything such like that did occur.
But who were the first priests that you ordained here in Oregon?
Father Will Walsh
Willie Walsh
was the first one that I ordained.
And Father
And
Murphy
then
here was number
Father
2.
Muffenmeyer and his companion, Father Osterman. They were on the Feast of the Epiphany, 1927, wasn't it?
Right. Father Osterman lies down here, a half a block just below the arch.
in case you want him. Father Muffenmeyer said if you wanted, you could have Osterman come over here for the interview.
We'll lower a microphone into the grave.
Yeah, well, that's what Muffenmeyer.
You asked a while ago what we thought of when we heard it was the Archbishop coming out here. We had a seminarian named Jesse Roller at St. Paul who came from Iowa. And when he heard that Bishop Howard was made Archbishop, he said, I'm going to switch from my diocese to Oregon. And he did come out here. He was a classmate of mine at St. Paul. Jesse Roller, that's where we got the word, you know.
Who was that?
Jess Roller.
Oh, yes.
He switched to Portland after he heard that your Grace
Well, was
coming out
Bishop
here.
Gredeman there at St. Paul?
Bishop who?
Gredeman.
Not my time.
Well, there was a classmate
No.
of Jess Rollers, because I was just reading some of these letters that the Archbishop got on his 96th anniversary, and this bishop said, you no doubt remember very well, Jess Roller and I were classmates, and he volunteered for your diocese.
Well, there might have been other dies, but he wasn't the Bishop of St. Paul.
No. I mean, a classmate of Jess Roller finally became a bishop in the Midwest somewhere.
Oh, I wouldn't know who he was. He wasn't at St. Paul with that name.
Well, how far was Jess Roller behind you, Muffy?
4 years.
Oh, well, you probably wouldn't remember who
He
the
was
man.
he was in philosophy.
I think that was the man who later became Bishop of Crookston, Minnesota.
No, Archbishop, I don't think so. I saw the letters. I was going through them this morning, and it seemed to me it was somebody from Iowa, but I don't know who it would be anymore. I can't recall. Might have been Crookston, but I don't. Who would that have been at Crookston? I don't recall.
I didn't know him, of course, personally, but I heard that one of the former students of the college in Dubuque, had been made Bishop of Crookston, but I can't recall his name. I didn't know him, of course.
No.
He came years after I
Well,
had
he
left.
just mentioned that Jess Roller, who came out here, was a classmate, and he said you may
That's how he
recall
came
that
out.
that he came out and worked for you, and we were classmates in the seminary together.
Father Laidlaw, when were you ordained?
I was the third one
Number
ordained,
The
three.
the fourth.
fourth one, because
I was
Osterman comes
ordained
in
in
third.
1927, was the only priest ordained at that time.
What was your impression of the new Archbishop?
But he was a wonderful man.
That's a very direct question.
In fact,
In English, but it took a long time to get an impression.
I had never been home for a Christmas vacation, and during my deacon year, Father Camel insisted on my coming home because he wanted me to meet the new bishop. He felt that was rather important. He thought there were going to be some rather drastic changes soon. There were. And so I assisted in mugging up the ceremonies at the cathedral, but Your Grace was too kind to say anything about it. I was not very good on ceremonies.
Who were the priests that met your Grace when you, by train, we went up Spokane to meet you when you came? Some of them are former pastors?
Oh, there was a large contingent from Portland there.
Monsignor Rao was mentioned in particular.
Rao?
Not Rao, Hildebrand. He was-
Hildebrand.
And Father
Daly?
Hughes.
Wasn't Daly among them?
Father Hughes, I know, was
Hughes?
there. And I think Father Daly, wasn't he?
I thought so, yeah.
Very likely.
Yes, I think so.
Thompson.
I think there were about 10 or 12.
Thompson.
See what they did. The president of the SP&S gave his presidential private car to bring the Archbishop and the priests from Spokane down here into Portland. That's how they went. Of course, there weren't any planes at that time anyway, but he was courteous enough to give his own presidential car to bring this group down here.
In one of the Spokane daily papers, they had an account of my arrival in Spokane on my way to Portland, and I think I was delayed there for a couple of hours waiting for my train to Portland. So a newspaper reporter came down to interview me, and he, in his published report in that daily paper, in big black headlines, someone sent me a copy of the paper. They had Greek bishop here. They meant Greek, G-I-T-E,
Oh,
but
yeah.
they had G-I-T-K.
Oh, I see.
Greek archbishop here briefly.
Was
Well, you
Father
did-
Thompson in the delegation that met Your Grace?
No, he wasn't. Something happened that he couldn't come. I think he was one of those who was supposed to come, but something happened that he couldn't make it. He was at the station to meet me when I arrived in Portland.
He was a St. Paul man himself.
Yes. Father George Thompson was a very remarkable man. He was a very scholarly man, a very fine gentleman in every respect. His health was never very good. Even as a student in the seminary, he was never very strong physically,
Eyesight was very poor.
but he was always a splendid student.
You never turned on any lights, for one thing.
One of many great kindnesses Your Grace did to me was to make me assistant of Father Thompson.
Yes, he was a
I
very
couldn't
good
be
man.
sufficiently appreciative of him. He was a wonderful man.
I know he took me out for a drive around the Gresham area not so long after I arrived here. He drove me out there one day, and it was a very beautiful day in early spring. I know it was late, of course, but still spring-like weather. I suppose it must have been about sometime in September, a beautiful fall day. And so I remarked on the beauty of the country, and Father Thompson had lost most of his hair. You remember he had just a few long hairs still left, and when he was driving his car, he usually took off his hat, and he would drive occasionally, you know, with one hand, and the wind would blow those stray hairs around a bit, and he'd put up his hand and smooth it down. And he, in reply to my, remark about the beauty of the country, he said, this is a beautiful country. He said it'd be a wonderful country in which to live a gypsy life if a man didn't have to work for a living. I can remember that so distinctly.
He never really woke up until midnight, Your Grace. And though I was always saying the early Mass, but it was worth keeping myself awake to get him started.
Yes, I know.
He was quite a man. He had quite a sense of humor.
Yes, he did.
And a great shrewdness and a very great kindness about other people.
We're bringing in this question of population. I was always the impression, Archbishop, too, there are about 60,000 Catholics when you came here. Unfortunately, the 1927 directory has disappeared, which would give exact. But I went to 1928, and I'm quite sure that's a typographical error, because they had just a little over 40,000.
Well, that was a great mistake.
I think it was a typographical error.
Oh, yes, typographical
in the
error.
28, because I was always the impression we had 60,000.
No, I know there were at least 60,000, but I think there were more.
See, now, when you retired, there were just a little over 200,000 Catholics in the Archdiocese. And I think, as you say, there were 80 priests. I think the 1928 directory, which reflects 27, which is not quite as accurate as it should be, there were 124 religious priests and 80 diocesan priests in the 28 directory, which reflects 27, which is really a year later. And at the present time, when you retired in 66, which places itself in the directory of 67, there were 191 diocesan priests.
And how many religious?
I think, as I remember, there was just a little over, or somewhat over 200.
I think there were over 400 priests.
Yes,
though.
that's what I mean.
430, if I recall rightly. 435 or somewhere in there.
Yes. They had.
So that was quite a growth. You see, what increased the growth here was the Second World War. We had many war industries, and people came here from all parts of the United States to work in those industries. And they were so much taken with the country here and the surroundings and all that they remained here, and they brought relatives and friends. So a large percentage of those people were Catholics. So our increase in the number of Catholics after the Second World War was very great.
Well, I think, Archbishop, also, your population increased tremendously during the Depression days of the 30s, because they were really blown out with their dust in North and South Dakota.
Oh, yes.
There was a tremendous amount of those people who came out in that area. You see, if you look at it from a graph standpoint, it's rather interesting. At one time, Marion County, which may have it now, had about 20% Catholic. Would you have places like St. Paul, and Jarvis, and Woodburn, Mount Angel. Probably the only county in the state that was on a national average of 20% Catholic. Portland proportionately. And then you went into Washington County, and you went into around the Salem area, but they thinned out very, very much as you went further south. The further south you went, there was practically nobody. For example, even when I went to Eugene in January of 29, we had the whole Lane County, and I'm quite confident that if we had 700 or 800 Catholics in the county, this is the entire amount in Lane County out of 70,000 people. Whereas now today you probably have about 170 or 180,000 Catholics, people, but you're Catholics, you must have 6 or 7 parishes in there, you see. So the Catholic, as you went down into Grants Pass in Roseburg, there was practically nobody from the standpoint of the Catholic Church, and they have grown tremendously.
Shortly before your grace arrived, roughly in the year 1922 and so forth, we had that great outbreak of bigotry. It was the time that the school bill passed, making it a criminal offense not to send your children to the public school. And it was the time of the Ku Klux Klan, which was very strong around Roseburg and rather strong around Eugene.
Well, I tell you, Father, if you analyze the votes, we didn't lose out. Now, the percentage basis, I just don't recall, but I would say your percentage of voting for the bill, which would abolish the private schools, was about 55 or 56%. The negative was our other group in the 40s, but we were only about 10% Catholic in the state. And if you study the historical thing, it was the cities that defeated the Catholic Church. You went into Portland, into Salem, and Eugene principally. Those were the 3 big cities that defeated us. When you went into the rural areas, there was no problem. Now, if you take Eastern Oregon, only one county over there voted to abolish private schools, and that was Baker County. Every other county in Eastern Oregon, it's rather surprising, every county voted against this bill to abolish private schools, but it was the large cities where they concentrated on their work, and that's where they won out on the positive vote.
Portland was the worst.
Portland, Salem, and Eugene. If you look upon this, in fact, I wrote a number of years ago, I wrote to the Salem office to get the exact number of votes on it. And if you study it, you'll find it was those 3 areas where we actually lost out in the big cities.
One reason for that, Bishop, would be this. I know it's a little bigoted, so excuse it. The school bill was prepared and passed largely through the work of the Scottish Rite Masons.
Of the South, mostly.
And they were extremely strong in Portland.
Yes, well, and they were the big cities.
Oh, yes. So that would explain a good deal of that. It was
anyway,
a very, very strange picture, though. Now, I was born in Portland, brought up in Portland. I knew a lot of these people. And a number of people that you never would have suspected of bigotry, who were family friends and so forth.
Who you think they were first cousins of the Pope.
Yes, turned bigot.
Yeah.
And the strange thing is that from a religious point of view, it helped us a great deal. Because a lot of people who had been rather not very zealous in the practice of their own religion suddenly became angry.
Not only that, you had
extremely good Catholic.
Father, if you analyze the financial setup, I remember I was at Corvallis, and we had an assessment of $100. Well, I thought that was impossible. It would take weeks and weeks and months to raise $100. We raised over $500 in cash the first Sunday to defeat that bill. It was remarkable the number of people, fallen ways that came to our rescue, and as you say, came back. It's the old story. When you're being crucified, these people come to the front.
Yes.
I left for seminary at the time of the school bill election, you see. In fact, Father Keenan and I voted as absentee voters down in seminary. And I always have a great affection for the Ross Island Bridge and the Selwood Bridge, because the county commissioners who had been elected by the Orange Group were caught in a first-rate swindle. And they were recalled, and by the time
How can you justify your conscience being gratified about that?
Because by the time, to see people of a higher caliber being elected because they were recalled.
Yeah, but how could you be gratified at the bad results of some people that were caught in a swindle? How can you justify your conscience?
Because we caught up with them. There was one, he had been manager of the Multnomah Club and was quite a friend of my uncle, Plowden Stott, who was a little fellow but a great football player. And Plowden turned on him. He said, "You know, John," he said, "I did everything I could to get a man to fight, but he wouldn't fight." And they caught him so that he had to live over in Vancouver because he would have been arrested if he'd crossed into Oregon.
Well, I think we probably turn better to where getting the area of Archbishop Howard, and I think we probably better stay with that a little bit. We get into
or Baker. Why don't we talk a little bit about...
Well, I was thinking, Father, why don't we simply... I think we ought to get the impression for history regarding the fire at Mount Angel. It would seem to me
Yes, right.
would be important, because that there'd be very few at Mount Angel, even today, that would remember too much of it.
You know, my first visit to Mount Angel was the day of the fire that burned the old monastery there so completely. And I never saw such a complete ruin. There wasn't a piece of wood much larger than your hand left of that building.
Just a minute, you want to hold that? Can we keep on going, Father? All right. Go ahead, Archbishop, please.
Archbishop Howard's arrested. He is, but he's a bit busy right now. Could I take a number and have him call you back? Oh, yeah.
You got a pencil?
It'd be easier if you called him back, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, in about another hour or so. Okay. Yeah. He'll call back.
They'll call back.
Yeah, it was Father Southfield. He'll call back.
Oh, all right.
Sheriff.
He said he'd call back, did he?
Yeah.
Yes.
Or did he want me to call him?
Maybe you better call him. I'm not sure.
I'll call him later on, yes.
We're still on the Mount Angel fire now, Archbishop.
Well, Father Gregory took me out when we got news of the fire, and they got the fire department from Salem, all the surrounding country there that had any fire equipment of any kind, of course, came to the rescue to do what they could, but it was complete loss. Everything was gone. I never saw such a complete ruin of any building or any place, and it was a very large building. They lost a very valuable part of their library.
They lost all their library.
Did they?
Oh,
I
yes.
thought they
They
saved
saved
some
some
of it.
books.
Did they, Father?
Yeah, they threw some books
Oh.
out, yeah. Father Jerome got a crew of the seminarians, and they lugged out some of their books. They saved some.
Well, you were there, weren't you?
No, I was in seminary when
Oh, the
that
seminary
happened.
already?
Didn't blame that on me.
Didn't have anything to do with the fire, did you?
No, I was in St. Paul, thank
I'm
God.
relieved.
I admired the spirit of the Benedictine community very much. There they were without anything, Everything was gone. Their living quarters, completely demolished. And their seminary, college, they were just opening their college for the year, college department for the year. And of course all the students who came, many of them were resident students, of course, from various parts of the state, from various parts of the country. And of course they all left for their homes, their respective homes immediately. And there the poor Benedictines were left. Abbot Bernard was the abbot at the time. He assembled his community that morning after the fire in one of the small buildings, frame buildings that had been left, and they recited the office, the divine office, together in the midst of all that dilemma, and ruin.
What building could that have been, Muffy, that was left?
It was an old frame building.
Probably where the
I don't know
sis-
what they used.
It could have
Well,
been one down near the printing office. Only
Well,
I
did
could
the
imagine.
sister's house burn at that time, too? I don't think so, did it?
No, I don't think so. Might have been.
Might have been the sisters.
My impression of the fire with is that Mount Angel will have a more definite description. They feel that it would probably started in the gymnasium some way.
Garage.
It's the garage.
Yeah.
And then it spread into the chapel, which was a wooden chapel.
No, it sucked into the gymnasium, and then it sucked into the seminary side.
No, but I understand the chapel first. Then from the
that's
chapel,
awful.
you see, and they considered this a fireproof building, but they overlooked something very important, that no building is fireproof,
That's right. It had wood in it.
because they had wooden building, and there was a wooden cross. Remember, Muffy, when they had that wooden overhead there to protect you from the weather? It just hit that. It hit the doors, and the floors were all wood. The frames of your classrooms, of all your rooms were all wood, and just swept right straight through on all of
Yeah.
that, you see.
The tremendous wind blowing that night.
Yes, but even so, I mean, we had whenever you have wooden floors and all of that.
That's right.
We're talking about fires. I don't think we've ever had a church that was destroyed by fire in the history of our church in Oregon, in Portland.
Completely destroyed.
Completely destroyed. I remember. I just can't remember it, nor can I find it any, which is rather an important thing to realize, that a church has never burned. Now, we have many churches, other places that burned out through the archdiocese with no fire protection.
They tried to destroy St. Charles.
Well, but wait a minute.
But
We're
the one
talking
who
about
was
a
doing it
destruction.
was a firebug who was in the fire department.
Well, that doesn't make any difference, Jack, whether it was the fire department bug or anybody else. The fact is, we can make a statement that no church was totally destroyed in the city of Portland, whether it's by accident or arson or anything else.
That was where they caught him.
Well, I've been here 48 years. There has never been a complete destruction of any church in that time.
Would that be also for the entire archdiocese, Archbishop?
Well, it seems to me that the Verboort Church was a complete loss. The old church in Verboort.
Bandon.
Well, and wasn't there a church burnt down there in that south of Marshfield, or was that before your time, that was destroyed by fire, Archbishop?
It must have been before my time.
Well, I remember there was a church that was destroyed down in before your time. We've had some of the churches that were destroyed by fire, but I don't think in Portland, as far as I can see.
No, not in my time.
Which is a great compliment to the fire department of Portland.
Bandon went.
Well, yeah, but when did Bandon go?
Well, it was in 1936, I believe.
That's true.
That would be an archdiocese. I thought there was a church had gone down
there.
there.
About the insurance, you remember? That was on the insurance deal.
Well, that was the church that I was thinking of then, that had been destroyed by fire, and Verboort, the Archbishop says.
We know that went.
But most of those places had very little fire protection. That's the point I'm trying to bring out.
Of course, Bandon went with the extreme fire in the whole community.
Yeah, well, of course, that's what happened like in Seaside, too,
yeah,
when that place was burned. Now, we've had some schools burnt, like North Catholic, St. Stephen's Church School Bill burnt, and then the one out at
Woodburn lately.
And the wood burned, and then you had St. Andrew's at one time. They burnt.
The church at Seaside was burned by fire.
Yeah, the whole town was destroyed.
The one before the present one, back in Father
yeah, but that was
Langard's
destroyed
side.
by practically the whole city went at that time. Father Laidlaw. Now, I think St. Andrew's also burned, but at that time I think it was the classrooms and just
That's
the
right.
structure of another building. But we didn't construe it as a church as such. You ran into those occasions like St. Andrews where you had classrooms and upstairs was a church, but we wouldn't construe it as totally as
They
a
opened
church.
classes the next day.
I don't
in the
think there's
circus
any.
tent.
Yeah, they started in a tent the next day with it.
Circus tent, yeah.
Do you remember the priest who built the present? I think he built the present church in the Seaside. He was a Frenchman.
Father Langlard.
Langlard. Well, you know, a strange thing. When I was here on my first visit to Portland in the summer of 1911, I said Mass. This other priest and I said Mass at the old cathedral there every morning. And one morning, Father Monsignor Moynihan, the rector of St. Paul's Seminary, arrived in Portland with that priest, Father Langlois. At that time, I don't know whether he was incarnated in St. Paul, but he had been working there a long time.
Well, he wasn't a professor, Archbishop.
He what?
He wasn't a professor at either St. Thomas College.
He might have been at the college. He was not at the seminary.
That's what I mean. I think he was at St. Thomas at the college.
But I met him there. He and Monsignor Moynihan had breakfast with us that morning. And I had no idea that, of course, that I would ever land out here permanently. And nobody else did, of course, at that time. But he liked it so much, apparently, that he asked to stay here. And he was in Seaside for many years, wasn't he?
Yes, Your Grace. I was fortunate enough to know him a little. He was at Seaside, and he built the church at Hammond, that one that we later restored a bit. And the war came, and he went into the American Army. This is the First World War as a translator.
French interpreter.
Yes, and after he came back from the war, he was given a good job on the faculty of the University of California. and I met him later while he was a teacher there at the University of California. He always looked back happily on his experiences in Oregon, and he did a lot of very, very good work.
He was a tremendous worker at Seaside.
He was had a very charming personality. People liked him.
Yes. I can remember him as a very attractive man, very pleasant man to meet and talk with.
He said he felt that being a teacher and the faculty of the University of California enabled him to get into contact with people. That was very helpful from a missionary point of view, and I think he was right. With his own disposition, his fine personality, and his excellent priestly
I
ideals.
recall on that visit that this priest and I went out to visit Portland, now Portland University. It was then Columbia, and there were only 4 or 5 Holy Cross priests on the faculty at the time. Of course, it was in the summertime, and there were no students there. But they were very gracious to us and asked us to stay for dinner with them that evening, which we did. And the only building that they had there was Old West Hall, which is still standing. And then they had that huge old gymnasium.
Yeah,
You recall that?
Very well.
Floor, yeah.
It's a terrible place.
Just ready to fall down.
Mhm.
But that was standing still. And they were just starting the construction of
Christie Hall.
what is that hall?
Christie Hall.
Christie Hall.
Well, actually, the name Columbia University was a misnomer because they didn't really have any college there.
Oh, no.
Because I enrolled in Portland University in the fall of 1915, and the next day they told me, well, you better not stay here. You're the only one in philosophy. The only one in college.
It's a prep school.
Yeah, it was a prep school, pure and
It's a
simple.
little bit of place.
And
Not too much.
so I went back to Mount Angel, and that's for 2 years of philosophy.
They were doing some farming then. I think they had about 80 acres originally
Great deal, Your Grace.
in the land there, and they kept a few head of stock. They had several cows, I know, and the Sisters of the Presentation from someplace in North Dakota, I suppose about 7 or 8 of them were there taking care of the domestic department.
Weren't they French sisters?
Yes, they were.
Oh, I thought so.
When they were exiled from France at the time of the Troubles in the early part of the century, they came out.
And they used to churn the cream, and make butter from the cream that they got from those
A
few
lot of them
cows.
couldn't speak English even when I met them.
What about some other orders of sisters, like the Holy Name Sisters, the Providence Sisters?
Well, of course, the Holy Name
Very
Sisters
important.
had been here for many years at that time, and they were very well organized. I think Mother Flavia was no, she couldn't have been the superior at that time, was she?
Yes, Your Grace.
She might have been.
And she was the one who started the normal school program.
This archdiocese owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to the Sisters of the Holy Names. They've been here about 135 years
Yes,
now.
Your Grace.
Came in 1859.
Just think of the debt of gratitude that the whole Northwest country owes to those Sisters of the Holy Names during all those years. And they put up with so many sacrifices, endured so many hardships.
Mother Flavia was a native, Your Grace. She came from Jacksonville.
I think that nun was at least 75 years ahead of her time in the field of education.
That's what they said. That
She had the greatest vision. We just can't begin to repay those sisters for what they have accomplished. It's too bad now that they don't seem to, have old-time vigor as a community, but of course no community has, I guess, no religious community at the present time.
Your Grace, I hope, I was talking to one of them recently, that there'll be a rebirth.
I think they will.
There are some fine nuns still there, and they're unhappy about some of the changes.
Down here at Jacksonville, that was their first mission school outside of Portland.
Is that so?
And they were there during the smallpox epidemic, during the Civil War, back in 62, 63. And they had just a little convent there. The people down there in that area talk about them still. It must be about the 4th generation, isn't it?
That's right.
And they love the memory of those holy. They didn't know, the people now don't never knew them, of course. They're several generations removed from that time, but they talk about them still.
Well, one of the sisters died as a result of it, you know.
I don't think they died, but they were terribly marked.
I thought one of them died. I'm not too
I don't
sure
think so, but she was
died, so-
terribly. They were all marked.
Yeah.
But there was one of them came very near death, and her face was just a mass of pockmarks.
They were at St. Paul, too, Your Grace.
Yes.
Well,
My mother had
the editorial is one of the most beautiful pieces of literature that I've ever read on the
And
testimony.
you know,
of the
during that
sisters.
smallpox scare in that area down there, those four sisters, two of them went out and nursed the smallpox sufferers in their individual homes. The other two turned their little convent into a hospital, and they took all the sick they could accommodate. They couldn't accommodate more than perhaps 3 or 4, but they stayed there and nursed them there. And the other two went all through that community to private homes, and every one of them contracted the smallpox.
My mother was educated by the Sisters of the Holy Names at Old St. Mary's Academy and was taught by many of the original sisters who had come out first.
And what wonderful women they turned out
There
from their
was the
academy.
one she was especially fond of was Irish and very proud of it and rather anti-French. And when someone got sick of her community with tuberculosis, they were particularly prone to tuberculosis, she insisted on nursing the patient herself.
Of
So
course,
that if anyone was going to get
if you analyze it historically, all these academies had a tremendous influence because they were so far superior in the education of girls compared to the public schools, without any reflection on the public schools. They had music, they had art. In those days, your public schools didn't have all of these fringe benefits as they were called then. Now they are considered necessities. But your wealthy people of non-Catholic families would attend it. I could remember with pride the elderly ladies, Eugene, that attended at Salem.
especially Jewish.
Yeah, yes, well, a lot of everybody else. And you could go to your academies around the place like the Dalles and Baker, Salem, Mount Angel. They sent their children there so they became first-class ladies when they went out, something that did not have all those fine arts, painting, music, sculpture, all these things that they had in these places. And that's where the sisters made their money in the early days in their academies. Now, they had boarding schools in which they didn't make a great deal of money, but they made it in all these different, your pipe organ, your violin, any musical instruments, and your arts, painting, and all this thing that they developed. So when you talk about your relatives going to the academy, many non-Catholics went to these academies because they were first-class institutions. In
One
the
of
early
my
days.
in-laws, whose mother was a survivor of the Whitman massacre, and the family tended to be anti-Catholic. Nevertheless, they sent her to St. Mary's Academy because she got
Well,
better
I think
training.
that this was the policy in those days, without any question, Father. If you wanted your girl to have a first-class education, which they could not receive as real ladies, with many of the things you had, reading and writing and arithmetic, but they did not have as they would have today. They'd have music, they'd have arts of all kinds, but they didn't in those days. The sisters were the only ones that had it.
What about the Sisters of St. Mary of Oregon that were founded as a
They
diocese?
came here in the early 80s, and they deserve great credit, too, for what they have accomplished. They started with nothing. They took this land out here. I wouldn't be sure of the exact number of acres, but I think they had 160 or something like that. And they got it for almost nothing, you know.
Well, the Archbishop Gross donated it to him, Archbishop.
Well, I know, but I
Historically,
suppose he got it for almost nothing, you know.
about 40,000, according to the Sentinel.
Is that so?
I mean, whether that's accurate or not, but that's what the Sentinel had.
I wouldn't think that. I wouldn't know where he would get
Well,
for
I don't.
the-
Well, if you know Archbishop Gross' history, I don't know where he got it from. He may have let somebody else pay for it in due time, but he bought an awful lot of property. But now, whether this is accurate or not may be another thing. But I ran into
Well,
that.
it might
Archbishop.
be. But weren't they fortunate? And they put up with so many, many hardships. Their old mother house was across the canyon road here, you know. And that has become so valuable. The sisters have leased a number of acres there, you know, the Kmart and those the service stations, and there's a branch bank there now. One day that's going to be a very thriving business section.
Well, it's a valuable section right now.
Yes.
You don't have to wait 5 or 10 or 15 years from now.
No, that's true.
Didn't they mostly work in the schools here, or did they do other things as
Yes,
well?
almost from the beginning they began to take schools in Verboort and that country out there, Sublimity, all those places, and they're still teaching out there, you know, in those places.
I think historically they started Sublimity, and then Father Verhage came along. He appealed to these sisters to come over to Verboort. I think that was their second place. Then Archbishop Gross saw the possibilities of a development of a novitiate and so forth, and bought this property for them and urged them to come over here, and then to take care of the orphans. See, one of the most valuable things I think that they have done from the standpoint of the Archdiocese of taking care of those orphans for years and years
For
and
years
years and
and
years. And in which the state practically gave them nothing. I don't recall, but I saw somewhere at one time the state was giving them $5 per month per child. And that wouldn't go very far, I don't care when it is.
When I came here in 1926, all they had out there was that old 3-story frame building.
Yeah, so my Father Haysacker was there at that time, wasn't
Yes,
he,
he was
Archbishop?
superintendent.
The year before your grace came, I was a seminarian, and I went to their 25th anniversary in that old wooden building.
Well, I visited that old building many times
was
because
a
Father
terrible
Haysacker and I
place.
were classmates.
They had about 135 or 140 boys there, and even in those days. And they had little boys who were not more than 6, 7 years old in the minimum department.
Well, it wasn't altogether orphans, or necessarily all orphans. It was sometimes separated
yes.
families, or a father that had died, and the mother couldn't take care of the children, or a mother died, and therefore there was no mother instinct there to take care of the family. So they would be put out there. It was called an orphanage, but it wasn't strictly an orphanage in the sense of the father and mother both being dead.
Sort of a boarding school.
It was a boarding school for children that did not have a complete set of a father, or sometimes where they had difficulties with the children that they would be taken. Father Haysacker did a fabulous job.
Wonderful job.
Yeah.
No one can ever repay Father Haysacker for the sacrifices that he made.
But you know, the Archbishop, did you ever realize that when they were looking for money, they had a priest who was a priest of the
Toward
precious
you.
blood.
Move it toward you.
There was a priest of precious blood who really came out here
Okay.
and drew the plans for those buildings and everything. And secondly, then they sent another precious blood priest who stayed out here for 18 months to raise money. We've always thought that it was just the bishop and the diocesan priest, but a precious blood father came out and raised the money. Didn't raise all the money, but spent 1.5 years out here, to almost 2 years raising money for this. And his superior before that came out for several months to draw the plans for this institution.
What years were those, Bishop?
Well, when the sisters moved here in the early 80s.
Oh,
Archbishop Gross was very much responsible for it.
Well, he was responsible, but I think possibly, historically, I'm not too sure. You see, these sisters originally were precious blood sisters by that name.
yes, I see.
And I have a suspicion that they had a correspondence with the precious blood fathers in Indiana or someplace where they came from. And so when they came over here and were confronted with this situation, they possibly knew of the precious blood order priests and persuaded them to come out here and to assist them. And their general or superior, whatever they may have called him in those days, actually drew up all the plans for the building. And then when he completed that, he went back and then sent out another priest to actually organize the raising the money. And if you go through the Sentinel, for years and years, it's a remarkable amount of money that they raised constantly. I would say put in there every week, and certainly once or twice a month, things were going on to raise money for this for this institution,
Bishop,
for the orphans.
if you'll pardon me, that was not the same community as the Sisters of the Precious Blood out here.
Oh, I'm familiar with that, Jack.
They
I'm
were
familiar.
a special order that this man had both priests and sisters in it.
Oh, I know.
That
I'm
German,
familiar with that.
whose body they brought out here.
There's no connection between the two. These original group came from Minnesota, Jack, whereas Father Brusso brought out the group from Canada because his sister belonged to the order, and he persuaded Gross to bring the precious blood. But this is an entirely different group. This was the group that came from Minnesota.
And they are
Georgia.
strong in Indiana, too.
The precious blood sisters, are they? Well,
They have a very large sanitarium in Rome, Indiana.
Is that so? Yes.
I have visited there once or twice. A very fine institution. Very fine. They give the knife treatment. You've heard of that?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Treatment.
I think, Father, while we're still on this subject, it might be interesting to know, in the Archbishop, the number of priests that are living now in comparison when he came here in August of 1926.
There were only, of the 78 archdiocesan priests who were incarnated in the archdiocese, I think there are only 6 left, isn't there?
Well, there's six, wait a minute.
Yeah, go ahead, I'll take care of it.
Yeah, I think there's 7, including myself, Archbishop. Of course, I don't belong to diocese, strictly speaking, anymore as such. There are 6 diocesan priests, including me, would be 7 on that are living.
It doesn't take long, doesn't it?
Well, all depends how it take long. 46 years is quite a long time.
Oh, no, that's just a dream.
They,
You know, I was reading some time ago a little bit of verse. Age is a quality of the mind, and if you leave your dreams behind, if love is cold, if you no longer look ahead, if your ambition's fires are dead, then you're old.
No kidding.
But if in life you seek the best, and if in life you find its zest, if love you hold, no matter how the years roll by, no matter how the birthdays fly, you are not old.
That would apply especially to your grace.